Welcome to Nonconventional. My name is Ela Crane, and today I have a very nonconventional guest with me, Brad Blanton. You may have heard of his name before. He's a psychotherapist who created the concept of radical honesty. He wrote 8 books. He's been married 5 times. He has 6 kids. And he's been arrested 16 times due to different civil rights movements, which we will dig into later on. Hello, Brad.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hello.
So, Brad, first thing first. So, your training is a psychotherapist, right?
Yes.
But you spend a decent portion of your life focusing on honesty and created this concept of radical honesty. Um, what caught your attention around honesty the first time?
All my life, I think for everyone, it's an issue all their lives. Is the question is how phony are you going to be in order to make an impression on other people? I sort of noticed that at an early stage, and I got in the civil rights movement when I was 19 years old, and that's a part of where a lot of those arrests came from. Were from demonstrations, and for me, one of the fundamental things that I learned in the civil rights movement was that all of the terrible things that happen to people and the categorization of each other and racism and sexism and all that have to do with developing categories instead of relating to actual people. And that people don't talk so honestly when they're advocates for something, they're just talking according to a theme that they're advocating. But honesty is when you talk without advocating a particular theme. You just say what comes up for you without too much monitoring. And it allows for a quality of intimacy that's greater than you have when you're being guarded about whether you're talking the right way about the right things at the right time. So it has to do with performance. And so I've always been interested in performance modality as compared to the being connected with other people. And I think probably I started learning about that in the civil rights movement first. And then in the anti-Vietnam War movement, I was anti-establishmentarian enough. And I learned a lot in jail. There was a lot of group therapy goes on there. uh, so I became gradually more and more interested in honesty because more and more often the issues between people came down to be something having to do with what was being withheld or hidden or kept secret or deceitful. And I think that probably radical dishonesty is the primary source of why human beings are so damn poor at taking care of each other so much of the time.
Now, you talk about monitoring ourselves. Is it really possible to act as if there is no one in the room when you're surrounded by people?
I don't know why you'd act like there's no one in the room when you're surrounded by other people. That's not quite the same thing to me. Say, what do you mean by
Yeah, sure. It's like as soon as there are people around us, and depending who there is in the room, like whether you're with your mother or your girlfriend or your best friend or your children, I feel like we change almost like roles,
uh-huh.
and our behavior changes, and there is some monitoring involved. The way we talk to individual people, like different people are different. And to me, the way you use the term like monitoring is if like gave me the impression that if we could just be who we are without like dipping into these roles, that would be the radical honesty. But maybe I misunderstood. Is that what you meant?
What I mostly mean is the radical honesty is to acknowledge and admit the roles right there while you're talking. That is to acknowledge that you
Okay.
are being differently because your mother's in the room, or to talk about that issue honestly rather than have it remain in the background, to bring things to the foreground that are often in the background.
And how would you acknowledge that you're behaving differently because your mother is in the room, for example?
Well, my daughter, Carsey Blanton, is a fairly famous singer-songwriter, and I was at one of her performances recently, and she was acknowledging that I was there, and she said, "There's a lot of honesty in this relationship." She had a song about masturbation, which she was going to sing to the audience, and she was standing there singing it right in front of her father. She said, "How many of you can do this with your father?" Ha! And I thought it was fun.
Okay.
It's like you're willing to bring up the issue, even if it's bothersome or embarrassing or doesn't reflect too nicely on you. It's something that occurred. The worst form of lying in the world, and the one that's the source of most of our problems in couples and relationships and so forth, is simply withholding, not saying what you know to be true, keeping from admitting something that you're keeping secret. That's just a form of self isolation, and it's deceitful to withhold itself. You act as though there's nothing to be said when there is something to be said.
So that makes me question what we withhold, because some of the information or the emotions we withhold are conscious and some are unconscious. Even we don't know what we are withholding.
Mhm.
How do you unpack that load?
You need help. You need to have an honest conversation with someone else who's listening. What happens is that you automatically forget or withhold or, automatically in the form of fronting your image to the eyes of other people. But the more you share about how you're doing that, the more they will share about how they do that. And the closer you feel, the greater intimacy will give you more information about who you are and more joy in your relationship to them. That is, intimacy is scary to everybody. It's probably people are more afraid of love than they are of anything else. Probably more afraid of love for sure than they are of anger, but they're plenty afraid of anger as well. But people hide their hurt feelings, their anger, their love, their lust. They do it by simply having it but not mentioning it. And it sets up a kind of a game in which your job is to make sure you don't actually share your life honestly. You protect your image in the eyes of other people the way you imagine they think of you. And that is a mistake because it's not nourishing enough. We all want some kind of connection. My new book coming out in the fall is called It's Touch and Go: Radical Honesty About Contact and Withdrawal. And the part of the problem with human beings not being very good at taking care of themselves or of each other is that they're basically lying all the time by withholding. They're not saying what they need, what they want, what they think, what they feel. They're performing in order to make an impression so that the person will like the way you act like you are, rather than being who you are and giving them a chance to know you and have them free to choose whether they want to be with you or not.
And why are we so afraid of love?
It's out of control. It's just like being out of control. We love it and we're scared of it. It's like somehow we have this image that we're in control. As long as we're thinking in advance, we're in control. There's a big difference between thinking and noticing. And if we lead with thinking all the time, it's fundamentally defensive. Because you're trying to anticipate
Mm.
what the other person is imagining about you. And you're trying to anticipate what they will imagine about you if you say or do something else. And you're all wrapped up in your mind, which keeps you distant from them because you're preoccupied with your own thoughts rather than able to contact them visually and with your ears and perceiving with your senses. There's a big difference between noticing and thinking. And we have to do both noticing and thinking to get along okay in the world. Way back about 300 years ago, Soren Kierkegaard said he was a great existentialist theologian. And Kierkegaard said we cannot separate that we cannot separate our being and our doing, but we attempt to do it. We're either doers or we're beers. Beers are people who are present to their experience, and doers are people who are always thinking about what they have to do next. Doing is one way to escape being. So for about 300 years, there were philosophers talking about this back and forth. And finally, I think it was Jean-Paul Sartre said, we cannot separate our being and our doing, but we don't know what to do with that. And then finally, the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, whose name was Frank Sinatra, solved the problem because he said, doobie doobie doo. And that was it. So he suggested that if you alternate being and doing, you might be better off.
Don't we all do that? Or do we do more than we be?
You do all the time and be very little. Unless you're
Okay.
meditating on a regular basis and you have a relationship of intimacy, meaning where you actually confess your faults and things that are not so good and things you haven't thought about much, and you're not always prepping to make an impression, then you do and be in such a way that being, which is a little more nourishing than doing, nourishes you. What our school system and our parents and our synagogues and churches and everything like that encourage us to perform in such a way that we make a good impression and do right, prove that we're good Christians or whatever it is. And we're always working on that. Someone asked me in a podcast a couple of months ago, what do you think is your most valuable therapeutic intervention? And I said, damn if I know. What do you mean? You don't know your therapeutic intervention? No, I know that. The intervention is damn if I know. Someone asks me a question and I say, damn if I know. What do you think? That's my strongest therapeutic intervention because it invites them to share with me their most recent experiences and cogitations. And when we talk about that, honestly, then we're on a different track than just talking about how we're performing in front of each other in order to make an impression.
And we could probably apply that in our relationships. Is that so?
I think so, don't you?
You just did it.
Well,
Yeah, because I was trying to think how I would apply this. Like if somebody was asking me a question, like in my private life, um, reversing that question would give them the chance to express how they feel about what they're asking, which is probably or maybe potentially what they wanted to do in the first place.
yes, and it also gives you an opportunity and permission to express that for yourself.
Yeah, right. If that person gives that space, because sometimes we are stuck with people who just want to express themselves and they don't give the space for others to exist around them. They just want an audience rather than two-way communication.
So then if you're an honest person, you'll say, I don't like the way you talk about yourself all the goddamn time. I'm tired of hearing about you. What else you got? Then that would be you being a little more honest rather than storing it for later.
How can we gain the courage to say things like that? Because this is the opposite of what we are educated to do and say.
I know it's the opposite of what we're educated to do and say, and it's the secret to our tremendous unsuccess as human beings. It's the cause of everything from marital discord to war. And it doesn't work. We've known for thousands of years that war doesn't work. And here we're still like, read what's going on with Russia killing people in the right now. And us yesterday killing someone. It took 21 years to finally get him after he'd killed lots and lots of people. And it's all talked of as necessary. I think if you say it very simply, some people do need killing. Okay, yeah, some people do need killing, so we need to kill a few of them. We need to do it on some basis other than the systems we have built, because our systems aren't working worth a shit.
How do you see the honesty between two people on a day-to-day basis, like communicating with each other, reflect on the entire system, like the justice system?
Well, what's valued is figuring things out according to previously stated statements of how you should behave and how the world should behave. So it's obviously a very intellectual comparison, evaluation, assessment problem. And the quality of life is not so much based on assessment, except that your attachment to those assessments interferes with your ability to perceive and notice things that are sensations you ignore because they're not pertinent to the topic at hand. So we end up excluding ourselves from the nourishment of commonplace experience. The nourishment of commonplace experience is more important than we generally think.
And how do we open up to that immediate experience? How do we open our senses to what's happening really instead of how we perceive and evaluate things?
Well, that's a great question. I wish I knew the right answer. But that's the great question. I just say that what you do is you practice, practice, practice. It's like, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. If you go to New York, someone tells you that, you go to Carnegie Hall by practicing. See, the idea is that you practice noticing. It enhances not only your capacity to notice, it also makes you better informed intellectually. That is, it is consistent with the same values, is just that not so exclusive of permitting what might not be relevant evidence, but you don't know. You just prejudge whether you know or not. One of the problems is that we have too much faith in our minds.
Mhm.
I took that phrase, a mind is a terrible thing to waste, to the civil rights movement, and changed it to a chapter in one of my books that's entitled, A Mind is a Terrible Thing, Wasted.
Why is the mind the enemy? And what exactly do you mean by the mind here? Like, I'm not sure if we are talking about the same thing.
I mean, the assessments and evaluations and comparisons and judgments, comparison with other things people have said and other things you've experienced in your life, and then keeping that all up there in your own mind. If you're talking to someone else about it and you're honestly saying, this is where I think I got this from, you might actually learn something from your own connection and conversation with that other person. But if you don't, you'll basically just perform and try to impress. And being trapped
Mm.
in performing and trying to impress is not an easy trap to get out of, because it has some rewards. And you generally think that you're doing okay as long as you're making a good impression. But if you're making a good impression on Donald Trump, I don't think you got much to brag about. It's like, basically, he's the greatest commercial for radical honesty we've had in years. I have to be grateful to him because he's such a perfect example of what not to do. That it makes my job easier to talk about radical honesty.
Yeah. But I would like to also point out to the opposite end of that spectrum, which is not wanting to hurt people, or at least that's what I found out about myself as I was listening to your book. Um, there are so many edits that I do in my mind before I speak to people
Yeah.
so that I don't hurt them. And there are so many assumptions. And I would like to share this because this was life changing for me. And this will hopefully express a tiny bit of the power of your book. I listened to your book a couple of years ago. And to do this interview, I re listened to it. And the morning I started, was a day before a trip we booked together, me and my husband, to go on a kite surfing trip in the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean. And I was about to pick up my passport from another embassy, like I needed a visa for India. And I went there and they told me that they lost my passport. And the first thought that came to my mind, oh my God, I can't fly tomorrow. I can't go to this kite surfing trip tomorrow. And the first emotion that appeared in my heart simultaneously was a relief. And I thought, hang on, this trip was supposed to be a birthday present from my husband. And here I am, like feeling relief. What is this?
Mhm.
And then after half an hour, they said they found my passport. But that gave me enough time to dig into that relief and realize that I really didn't have the energy to go on this beautiful trip, in the Caribbean, which was a present for me. And a part of me said, like, oh, what if they hadn't found my passport? Like, then I wouldn't be responsible for not wanting to go to this trip. And just because I was listening to your book right before, like, parking my car at the embassy, I thought, no, 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 radical honesty, let's practice this. So I took my passport, I went to my husband, and I said, look, I'm going to tell you something. Please forgive me. You booked this trip for me, for us, especially for me, it was a birthday present to go on a kite surfing trip. If you hadn't booked it like months ago, if you just asked me now, shall I book a trip tomorrow to go to the Caribbean? I would say no. I'm just so exhausted, so tired. Traveling halfway around the world seems like a huge deal to me. I wasn't going to say this because I thought this will upset you and it will cause like maybe a disappointment or an argument. But because I started to listen to Brad's book, it's his fault that I'm being extremely honest here. But can you understand me? And I said it and I almost closed my ears because I was like, here we go, the storm is coming. And he held my hand and he said, of course, I want to give you a birthday present, not a birthday burden. And that was it. And I was in tears thanking you, Brad, because I thought how easy it is that we make these assumptions and write these scenarios, and it didn't happen at all. It was the opposite.
Yeah, isn't that great? That was a good job of being honest and contactful there.
Exactly. And that gave me the courage to be honest with other people the following days somehow, because I could feel the magic, that, oh my God, it's not always what I expect to happen. So let me try. And so far, it's almost always worked for better. Like people, when you're truly honest, I feel, and you open up in a vulnerable way, people really listen. Yeah, I learned from you, so I'm grateful for that.
Well, good, thanks. We got a bumper sticker that says "Radical honesty, it works pretty good most of the time."
Can I have one? So, I mean, this was radical honesty for me as a beginner. But in your book, you go into radical, radical, radical honesty, like level 5, where you say, okay, if you ever cheat on your partner, you sit down together and you tell him or her everything, all the details, how many times you've cheated, in what positions, what happened exactly. And I wanted to ask you as I was listening to your book, what would be the benefit of all those details? I feel like it will just break my assumption again. It will just break and hurt the other person.
Mhm. First of all, about the preceding sharing, we call this a problem having to do with obligation versus preference. So when you felt obligated to accept the birthday present and go on the trip, even though your preference would be to relax and take it easy instead of do that, you reported that your gift was an obligation and you had another preference. And you were surprised to see that you could not only that you could get by with that, but that he was open to saying, "Okay, fine, that's all right. I love you. Don't do that." So that was turned out pretty good, and it often does, much more often than your mind tells you, "Oh my God, don't say anything about this," because your mind is usually paranoid. Your mind is fundamentally a paranoid instrument. And if you're using your mind well, you should always anticipate that something bad's about to happen. And your mind is to guard against anything bad ever happening. So you end up with these dilemmas called obligation versus preference. What should you do is a different question than what would you prefer doing. And I'm recommending that you always ask, what would you prefer doing? You'll ask the other one inevitably anyway, because you do have a mind. You've got a pretty good mind, which is both a blessing and a curse. uh, and so the obligation basically is not as much fun as what you prefer. What you actually prefer may be just like a bite out of an apple. What you're obligated to do is to swear love and fealty for the rest of your life. And the preference is much, much more enjoyable than the obligation. So then now to your advanced question, as you jump all the way to the highest level, what I ask is that you do the best you can to connect on the basis of reporting what you can describe happened. That is, when you're reporting a description of what occurred without a bunch of editorials in there from your mind, you can have a communication with your partner that you can't have when you're constantly doing editorials with your mind to slide in your bid that you must be right because this only makes sense. And it's a kind of a bad sales pitch, because a sales pitch that somebody tells a sales pitch right at the beginning doesn't work so good anyway. And so instead of doing the sales pitch, you say, well, I don't know what to do, but here's what happened. And this is how I felt when this happened, and this person said this, and I said that. I had some wonderful experiences when I was in graduate school. I was in therapy all along because I was studying becoming a therapist, and I was in group therapy groups and my own individual therapy, and I learned a lot of ways to interrupt my mind. I found that I learned more sometimes when I stopped thinking so much. That there's a certain amount of wisdom which is just ignoring your mind. You just say to your mind, just shut the fuck up and wait for it to suspend itself. Very difficult to do. It takes a lot of practice. But one of the reasons that meditation is worldwide recommended over so many centuries is because it is not just a mental thing. It's a thing about developing your capacity to notice, your ability to be present, your ability to register what comes as information from your senses, not from your memory or your comparative mind. We need to use both, but if we have one predominating over the other, we've got problems. So I suggest that people get dumber rather than smarter.
How? How do we get dumber?
It'd be a really dumb thing to say, well, I had this affair with so and so, and this is exactly what we did. You dummy, what are you telling me? Anybody knows better than to do something. That's dumber than hell, right? So,
If we go dumb and say that, like, I had an affair with so and so, what would be a good outcome of that? Like, why would we do that?
well, I like a how question rather than a why question. First of all, how would you do it is you'd have to make an agreement. I want to tell you the detailed everything about my recent affair with so and so in hopes that you, when you're hurt by it, you can get over being hurt. The answer to your original question is when you hurt somebody and you know you're going to, you be with them while they have the hurt. You stay with them and you don't play like it wasn't your fault or anything. You just say, this is what I did. This is what I said. I'm sorry you're hurting. You can't protect them from the hurt that they get from thinking that you betrayed them. So they get the right to do that. You get the right to listen and to go through that too. So it's not exactly all fun and games. I learned a few things in the civil rights movement. We were being nonviolent. If I was a white guy with all the values of and bad points of that in terms of advantage. But when we were black and white together, usually only 5 or 6 or 7 of us would get arrested at a demonstration. In Austin, Texas, once I was arrested, and they would take us to the police station. They wouldn't put us in jail because we got free interviews with the press. When we were in jail, they would come to the jail and interview us. But if they just detained us for 4 or 5 hours, the demonstration was over and they turned us loose and we went home. They didn't even formally arrest us. We didn't get any publicity from it. So they got kind of sophisticated. So they brought 5 of us in one day, and they says to this detective over there, "These 5s are being detained. Just keep an eye on them." He says, "Okay." And I said, "Well, on the way in, I saw a cigarette machine. I'll go get some cigarettes." And he said, pulls out a pistol and he lays it on the desk, says, "You're not going anywhere." And I said, "Fire away, motherfucker." And I walked 25 steps to the door. I was walking out, just waiting for it to hit me. It didn't hit me. I went out and got some cigarettes and lit one, came back in one more day and said, "What happened? Did you lose your nerve?" He said, "Just sit down.
Wow.
Just sit down and shut the fuck up." I said, "All right." And I did. But it was a test, and I was really glad. I thought I did pretty good there. If I'd have been black, the motherfucker might have shot me. But it was that mixture use of privilege and prejudice. But that was tested in such a way that I found it quite gratifying that I knew when somebody's bluffing just because they have a gun, they're still bluffing.
But were you testing courage or honesty there?
Well, it was courage and honesty. It took a little courage. I was scared. It takes a certain amount of courage to be honest because you're worried about the bad result. And so I suppose that honesty when you're scared is what a definition of courage is.
From my little experience about my birthday present, I found that the only way to gain courage is like you have to push it first, but when it works, it gives you further courage.
Yeah, I think
And when
that's
it
right.
doesn't,
Yeah,
it gives you the knowledge that or you can handle it, which converts into confidence again, which converts into courage
it
again.
does. And it makes you less intimidated in the world, period. I used to be
Yeah, that's
a
for
fairly nice guy. Now I'm a jerk and I'm proud of it. I had to work hard to turn into the jerk that I am.
Brad, you have 6 kids. What would your kids say about you as a father?
Some of them would say different things than others, but I would say that basically we just had a sort of a kind of a family reunion. All but one of them was there. He's a little mad at me at the time, and I didn't know he was my child until he was 12 because back in those days, we didn't know how to determine. She had been
Mhm.
living with another man, and she and I had just sex once, and she was pregnant, and the child didn't look like mine, so we agreed, and she married somebody else. And then when the lab test could be done, I sent some scrapings from my cheek, and it turned out that I was the father of that child. So I started paying child support when he was 12 and invited him into the family. But we've had feuds and stuff. But other than that, basically, we all love each other really well. And people have asked me questions about how come your kids turned out to be such contributors because they're, 2 of them are in doctoral programs and one of them's a famous singer-songwriter, Brad Blanton. And basically, my answer was lots of really good stepmothers. I violated conventional wisdom. You know, my longest marriage was 21 years and the shortest was only 3. And I had 5 of them, which is unconventional wisdom says you shouldn't. But we did keep on raising our kids together, and we did forgive each other and co-parent and got beyond just the I'm mad at you, we're leaving, and forget it from now on. We went ahead and had conversations where more honesty occurred. And we didn't live together anymore, but we co-parented and we honored each other as parents. So I think I've done a moderately good job of that. And I think the secret there was honesty.
You had an affair with a married or a woman who was living with another man, you said.
Yeah.
So where was the honesty there?
They weren't living together, but they were often spending the nights together. Yeah. Oh, they were honest. They knew it. This is back in the 70s. I was basically everybody was sleeping with everybody else. For about 5 years there, women were just as bad as men. It was really fun.
And what are your thoughts on marriage right now after 5 marriages?
I'm single right now, and I prefer living alone. And I like getting together now and then, but contact and withdrawal is what I'm writing my. This will probably be my last book since I'm 81 years old, but it's one of my last books anyway.
I hope not the last one. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Uh, what I'm after is that recognizing that authentic contact with other people is what nourishes both you and the other person. That the performance modality is limited. It's like, see, the contradiction is this: we all want contact, we all want human connection. And the problem is, we also all want withdrawal. We also want to be able to not have to be obligated to be with anyone, like have to go on a trip for a birthday present, for example. So obligation versus preference enters in there a lot. And so in everything from marital discord to war is caused by people having two directional desires. They want to do what they prefer and they want to do what they're obligated to. And those things are often contradictory. And so I recommend that people tell the truth about their hurt and be hurt and cry and experience the experience. And don't say, I won't hurt, or don't let hurt, or don't cry. Do it, have the experience and experience the experience. Because when you experience an experience, it can increase, decrease, and then go away. And when you resist an experience, it causes it to persist. So when you say, I can't be hurt, you stay hurt. I can't be angry, you stay angry. I can't be horny, you stay horny. It's the things that you resist that you maintain through resistance. And your willingness to experience an experience allows the experience to come and go, and then you go on to the next thing in your life instead of just repeating the same old shit over and over again. The radical honesty is like a ticket to a more open future.
What do you think of the marriage as a constitution? Like, we swear that we are going to love each other and be together for the rest of our lives. How realistic is that, and how different would it look if we were radically honest? What would marriages look like?
Well, that process of forgiveness, that is, of getting angry, telling the truth about it, being angry with each other, stopping short of beating each other up or killing each other, and let you experience the experience, And often the anger turns to sadness, and the sadness gets to a kind of grief and tears. And then often, somewhere pretty soon after that, there's some laughter that occurs. I don't know why that happens so much, but one of the reasons is because suddenly when you're in touch with your experience in your body, you get that, well, this is just this bodily experience. This is not the ultra meaningful end of life certainty, meaningful thing of my life. It's just that I've been hurt and I'm pissed off about it. And I'm not even as mad about it as I was 15 minutes ago if I pay attention to my body. And so you pay attention to your body as well as your mind. You have the possibility of your attention to your body rescuing you from your own mind. And that's valuable. When people learn that, they learn how to have conversations with each other at a deeper level because they share more honestly. Honesty is a really central key to intimacy, and forgiveness is necessary no matter if you're married to Jesus.
But what about the promise we make to each other that we are going to love each other for the rest of our lives? Do you find that realistic? Like, I'm just questioning, if we were all radically honest, what kind of promises would we make to each other in the first place?
Well, I'd say that you would recognize that a promise includes all those stages. When you're furious, are you
Mm.
still loving each other? Well, you're still keeping your word about sticking with each other to get to forgiveness, which is really the key. You know, I've written several marriage vows, and
Mhm. Yeah.
most of them I kept most of the time. That's about the best I've been able to do. And most of the people I see in therapy are claiming that the other person didn't do what they said they were going to do, and they're not doing what they said they were going to do, because you can't stay just cheery and happy and rosy and loving and sweet forever and ever. You're going to be the deep down bitch that we know you are, at least occasionally. The one of the things about radical honesty I'm putting in my new book is that all men are bitches and all women are bastards. So let's don't exclude anybody from the territory. That we
Yeah.
we all want our own goddamn way in a selfish
Yeah.
way.
How did your marriage vows evolve throughout your marriages?
I've been in a group marriage before too, where there were three couples.
What's a group marriage?
Three couples. We decided to marry each other, and we did for about 4 or 5 months. Everybody,
Oh, wow.
everybody
Okay.
slept with everybody.
Okay, never heard of that.
Well, it was too much goddamn work was the problem. And plus, the child rearing was very complicated because somebody had to take care of the kids while the others went with their lover. That was kind of hard to
Hmm.
do. There are lots of experiments going on in the world that have to do with people trying to learn how to forgive and renew. And forgiveness and renewal would be the key to whatever vows I would write now. Is that basically I promise to tell you the truth and work to forgive you and forgive me when we have conflict.
Yeah. Does forgiveness always end with forgiving ourselves? That's been my experience so far, but I don't know
I
if
think
it's
it's the
just
only
me.
way you can really forgive yourself, because in reality,
Mm.
there can't be a me and a myself unless you're schizophrenic. You can't forgive yourself without an intermediary unless you're
Yeah.
schizophrenic.
You mean we need like to get hurt by others to somehow grow? And what do you mean exactly for with that?
I say roses are red, violets are blue. I'm schizophrenic, and so are you. my, my theology is that God is schizophrenic, and that God and the devil are the same, and that the living as a schizophrenic, when you pray to God and the devil. Say, would you possibly lead in this way, please? You don't have any power. The reason that I say that God is schizophrenic is because God and the devil both do things that turn out to be both bad and good. So good and evil doesn't divide up just as two little simple things so easy. It's life goes on within you and without you. And when you get somewhere beyond dualism in your relationship to
Mm.
each other, you become identified with each other's and empathetic with each other. Even though you don't like what somebody does, you might end up forgiving them and feeling sorry for them for having done it. It's complicated, but it's possible and it happens. And forgiveness is the critical thing to me, at least this week.
I'm just thinking, like, the events that hurt us, are they in a way the necessary tools for our growth? Is that how you see? And is that why you say when you go beyond dualism, you realize that it's not actually good is good, bad is bad, but good is bad and bad is good?
That they're both good and bad. It's like basically the fundamental Buddhist idea is whatever happens, happens. And that's the blessing and the curse.
But we are like walking around with labeling machines in our hands generally. This is good, this is bad, this is what I want, this is what I don't
Exactly.
want.
Amen. I
And
say,
it's
yeah.
very hard to kind of stop that habit. You can shed it, but to truly stop that habit and be preference free, I haven't seen anyone so far that free.
Well, don't be too perfectionistic about it because you're just being that way about that. You see?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm actually holding a labeling machine right now
That's
as I
right.
say this now.
Right.
That's it. That's the dilemma.
That's right.
What do you mean by renewal? Forgiveness and renewal, you said.
I developed this chant. I ran an 8-day workshop for about 20 years called the Course in Honesty. And the design of the workshop was to give people the equivalent of 1 year of psychotherapy in an 8-day residential
Wow.
community. And the benefits of the year of therapy were that you become more capable of experiencing your experience and letting it come and go. And so you recognize that you're usually the creator. It's not the nature of reality. It's the nature of your stubbornness demanding that reality be other than it is.
Wow, we can get there in 8 days. I'm up for it.
Well, they're happening all over there. They're happening in 11 countries in Europe right now, and South America in a couple of places, and 5 or 6 cities in the United States. I sold my seminar business about a year ago, but kept the publishing business. And I helped some and get a little bit from the Radical Honesty Institute, which is incorporated here and in Europe. And it's growing, and there are about 25 radical honesty trainers in the world now. So it's possible if you want to do an 8-day workshop, you can find one somewhere. You could give it to Brian as a present and then make him feel obligated to go to it.
Yeah, yeah. I don't have to go, obviously. It's just for my husband. Yeah. Yeah, it's actually his birthday in 3 days. It's a good idea.
Yeah.
Where do we find these workshops, Brad? Is it all on your website,
You can
radicalhonesty.com?
start there and get anywhere. There's also Radical Honesty Institute and the Center for Radical Honesty. Either of those will do. And there are lots of videos and photos and short things written by people. So yeah, go to radicalhonesty.com. Basically, start there, and it'll lead you all over the world.
And if somebody listening right now wants to find out more about your radical honesty concept, like which one of your books would you recommend as the first taste?
I think reading Radical Honesty first is probably best, and then practicing radical honesty.
Yeah.
And then I have a book called Radical Parenting, which is the third one I'd recommend. But the primary coverage of radical honesty is in Radical Honesty and Practicing Radical Honesty.
Okay, final question. Considering the amount of experiments you've seen as a psychotherapist in relationships, and you've also experimented yourself as you shared, what were the most successful relationships? Like, is there a pattern we can learn from, we can kind of aim for across these different types of relationships that you have seen and experimented with?
I think you need to focus on taking responsibility for being the creator of what you feel and think and do in your own life. And you say, I'm mad at you. That means I have created being angry at you. I was attached to you doing a certain behavior and you didn't do it. Or I was attached to you not doing a certain behavior and you didn't do it. But my attachment is the source of my anger. I'm, however, mad at you. And so you say, I resent you for leaving and staying gone all night, day before yesterday. And you are energized, your heart rate increases, your breathing is constrained, and your right side is tighter than your left side, and you pay attention to that. And you hear what the person has to say back, but you stay in the argument. And when it changes, and you feel sadness, you be there. If it changes and you start laughing at it. I had one friend who used to say, let's wait and talk about this when it gets funny. And eventually it will. I've had bragging contests in some of the training of trainers. I ask trainers to compete with who has the best story about how they fucked up their life. That is, who in this room is the best fucker-upper of their life? And then they would compete. Oh, here's what I did. I married this woman who thought, and then I created, what did you do? I asked him, what did you do to create the suffering that you claim you didn't want? And we asked them to confess how good they were at ignoring something pretty obvious about themselves being the source of the conflict they were trying to get someone else to fix. And it usually turns into a big stand-up comedy source. It's like if you take notes on what comes out of that conversation, it's a great stand-up comedy routine.
And what's the point of doing this? Like, then you kind of claim your power that you created that and that you can create something else?
Well, when you take the responsibility for creating something you've been blaming someone else for exclusively, it's a big kind of surprise that when you start bragging about how good you were, you're also bragging how self-deceitful you were and how full of shit you were. And when people say, well, you're full of shit, but not as full of shit as this, and then they start competing on who is the most full of shit person in the room. And this is where good comedy routines come from.
But how is this useful?
Well, you're happy instead of miserable. That's mildly useful.
That's very useful, but at the cost of what? Maybe um, you could see yourself as a failure, or you could lose confidence in yourself.
You do, but if everybody's doing it together and they're trying to compete at who's the greatest failure, it's a whole lot more fun. And then it lightens up altogether. It's not as serious when you go back to the other position.
Amazing exercise. I look forward to experimenting with this actually.
Okay, good.
Brad, thank you so much for your time.
Thank
I
you.
very much appreciate it.
I had a good time.
And Take care and bye bye for now.
Okay, thanks.